word over there that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there.
Good. My name's Bob Foster with the Hoboken Historical Museum, and want to really welcome you for coming inside today. This is our second lecture, the Heaven, Hell, or Hoboken lecture series, commemorating the 100th anniversary of World War I, or as I should say, our involvement, or our official involvement in World War I. And we're so really happy to present this series. It's a 10-part series that will take us till May 2017, and there's a good chance we'll just keep it going. If you keep coming, we'll find the funding to do it. Want to thank our funders, the New Jersey Historical Commission, which gave us a special project to make this happen. We also received funds from Hudson County through the Office of Cultural and Heritage Affairs and Tom DeGeese, our county executive. And we also received money from the World War I Commission, which is made up of several entities. Really, this is a free lecture series. The only thing they really ask us to do is hand out a survey, which at a certain point, actually during the lecture, we'll be passing this around. Usually we have about 6 or 7 clipboards with lots of surveys on it. We'll pass it to the person on the end, if they could just fill it out, and then they could put their survey in the back of the pile, and then there'll be a blank survey for the next person. And then we'll collect them at the end of the evening, end of the afternoon. So that's really not that much to ask, just a survey. And I also want to thank Eileen Lynch, who wrote the grant. Where's Eileen? Let's give Eileen a thank you applause. And I'm just going to do a very, very brief introduction. When we were putting together possible speakers, one of the main books that came up was Dark Invasion by Howard Blum. And he's a very serious writer, and we were just very happy. He agreed to come immediately. He drove all the way from Connecticut. We do have his book for sale, both hardcover and softcover, so that is another way you could support the museum. We also have a few different items related to World War I in the gift shop, so if you want to purchase anything, that always helps. Most important thing is really to enjoy the talk today, and please spread the word about this series. Really, the centennial starts in 2017, so we've gotten a head start, but I dare to say this will be one of the more ambitious and notable lecture series. We are documenting each one of these lectures, and eventually they'll be put onto our website, which is being revamped also from a grant from the state of New Jersey. So things are going well here at the museum, and let's give the warmest welcome to Howard Blum.
Thank you. We all remember where we were 15 years ago today. We all remember how we first heard the news that 2 planes had crashed into the World Trade Center buildings. And in those 15 years, terrorism has become part of our daily life. It's part of the DNA of the world we live in now. It's part of the legacy that we'll leave to all our children. We no longer wonder we no longer wonder if there will be another terrorist attack, but we try to wonder when it will occur. And we also look back at 9/11 as the first terrorist attack on America. But that's not really the whole story. What do I mean? Well, that's what I want to talk about here this afternoon. Consider this harrowing scenario. A group of terrorists covertly enters the United States. They're well-funded, and they immediately begin a terror campaign against munitions factories, chemical plants, shipyards. They then plant a bomb that rocks the U.S. Capitol building. They launch a bold assassination attempt against the richest man in the country, one of the titans of Wall Street, and he's severely wounded. They set up an anthrax lab 6 miles from the White House and launch a biowarfare attack on 3 American cities. The president is warned by his cabinet that he can expect attacks on electrical installations, bridges, and subways. And in response to all this, the U.S. government decides to appoint a New York City police detective to hunt down these terrorists. They tell him to form a team and to go out and get them. Now, all these events that I just mentioned were all true, and they happened in 1915. It's a time when America was still neutral as a war was raging in Europe. It is a time when the German spy network decided it was important, it was vital to keep the United States out of the war in Europe, and to do that they had to keep America preoccupied with terror at home. It was a time when America first discovered it was a country full of targets. How did I hear about this story? Well, I read about it in a journal that the CIA publishes called The Annals of Intelligence. They called Tom Tunney, the New York City Irish police detective captain in the New York Police Department, who became head of this anti-terrorist group, as the first head of Homeland Security. And they called his organization, the group, the 12 policemen who he worked with, the first group that was organized to fight terrorism in America. It was the precursor to the vast Homeland Security network that now exists. These 12 New York City cops have morphed into 240,000 members of Homeland Security with an annual budget estimated at $98.8 billion, that's with a B, billion dollars. But in the beginning, the story really has its roots in the spring of 1914 in Germany, in the offices of the head of the German spy network, Major Walter Nicolai. Now, Nicolai was a famous figure in espionage at the time. He had done lots of daring deeds. He had snuck into Russia and gotten the Russian battle plans. But his major accomplishment when he became head of the German spy network was to send German agents all across Europe. He had agents in France, in Russia, in England, waiting for the war to break out, and they would be in position to cause harm and terror to Germany's enemies. But as the battle plans to launch World War I were being taken out of the safe, Walter Nicolai realized he had made a tremendous error. He had completely disregarded the United States. He hadn't paid attention to it. He had just sent one agent to America, a 70-year-old man who was working for a chemical company in New Jersey, and he was supposed to keep watch on all of America. And Nicolai now realized what a folly this was. He realized that if America went into the war on the side of the Allies, it could potentially raise a vast army, it could take advantage of the nation's vast resources, and Germany would be put at a distinct disadvantage. So he decided to do something about it. He came up with a twofold plan. First, he would prevent the United States from sending war material, supplies, munitions, clothing to the Allies who were fighting Germany. And secondly, he would try to break America's will. He would unleash a terror campaign against America so that the United States would be so preoccupied with what was happening on the homeland that they would never want to go off to fight a war in Europe. And to begin this terror campaign, he summons the German ambassador to the United States, Count Johann von Bernstorff. Now, when von Bernstorff gets his summons from the Foreign Office that he's supposed to report immediately to Berlin for a special assignment, he's a bit angry. At this point, it's June. He's in Long Island at his home on the North Shore that belongs to his American wife, who's an heiress. And he has plans to leave and within 2 weeks to go up to Newport, Rhode Island, where he has his mistress. And he really doesn't want to go off to Germany, but an order from the Foreign Office has to be obeyed, and he gets to Germany. He goes to the Foreign Office, and they tell him, we don't want to see you. You're supposed to go to this address on Königsbergstrasse. And he goes there, and he's not quite sure what to expect because there are no guards outside the building. But once he walks inside, it's a fortress. And he's led down by an armed soldier down a flight of stairs. He feels like he's descending down into the wine cellar. But there's Major Walter Nicolai, who's this fabled figure in Germany. And he meets with him, and Nicolai tells him two things. First, Germany will be declaring war within a couple of months. And secondly, you are to go back to America and to head Germany's spy network to lead a terror campaign that will keep America out of the war. And von Bernstorff is reluctant to do this, but he has to accept the orders. And then to sort of sweeten the deal, to make sure that von Bernstorff has the wherewithal to do all this, he gives von Bernstorff $150 million of bearer bonds to fund this network. This is in 1915, $150 million of bearer bonds. And von Bernstorff is told to keep them in a briefcase in his hand at all times. And if he's stopped on the ship by British seamen, he's to throw this suitcase with the bearer bonds into the sea rather than let the British know that this terror network is being set up. But von Bernstorff makes it to America, and he slowly starts setting up his terror network. He has his military attaches in place, the Navy and the Army, and he gets some offices in Lower Manhattan. And he has already a group of soldiers, espionage operatives, who can do the footwork for this. How does he have them? Well, German ships have been interred in the United States. They can't leave the territorial borders of America because the British has a blockade around the American ports, and their navy is much superior. And the streets of Yorkville in New York, and here in Hoboken, which is called Little Bremen, is filled with German sailors who are bored and looking for some way to serve the fatherland while a war is taking place in Europe. So he has this network, and they go to work very slowly, but things start to happen. Chemical plants are blown up, ships at sea catch fire, and the U.S. government really doesn't know what's happening. They think these are all accidents. Well, then the British do something. The British have set up a group of code breakers working in the Admiralty building in London in room 40B, and they cracked, despite all odds, the German code. The Germans thought their code was unbreakable, but these Oxford and Cambridge dons are somehow able to do it. And they find out that Germany has this spy network set up in America. So they send a coded message to the head of the British intelligence in America, based in New York, a man by the name of Guy Gaunt, and they tell him, inform the Americans, not that the code is being broken, but that these are terrorist attacks that America is enduring. So Gaunt goes to meet with Franklin Polk in Washington, D.C. Polk is the man in charge of what is, in a sense, an American intelligence network. And he tells them about these attacks. And now Polk is confronted with the problem, who can we get to defend America? Who can we get to track down these terrorists? And he thinks about military intelligence and naval intelligence, and they're a pretty ineffectual group. The Secret Service is just really concerned with counterfeiters. The Bureau of Investigation, which is the precursor to the FBI, well, they're not even allowed to carry guns. They have no legal authority, just fancy badges. So he then meets with the New York City police chief. And the New York City police chief tells him about a man who's been running undercover operations for the New York City bomb squad. The bomb squad, at this point, is not to defuse bombs, but to catch the bombers, as an anarchist campaign is raging all around the city. And this man has run an undercover operation where he's able to infiltrate one of the anarchist groups, and he stops them just as a bomb has been placed in St. Patrick's Cathedral. And his name is Tom Tunney. So the New York City police chief orders Tunney to come to his office. It's in the old police headquarters downtown on Center Street. It's now a fancy co-op building. The old gymnasium alone in that building where the young cops used to do their calisthenics just sold for $20 million as a single apartment. But he has Tom Tunney come up in the back door, which is by the shooting range, and he has a private elevator, and he's there meeting with the New York City police chief and Guy Gaunt. And Tom Tunney is given this assignment to start a Homeland security apparatus to track down these German spies, these German terrorists. And he's given an office across the street from police headquarters, above a bar, and he's allowed to recruit his own team. So Tunney is faced with this problem, and he decides, well, he'll need people who can speak German, but he doesn't want anyone who was born in Germany. So he wants to take cops from German families, but these cops must have been born in America. And he then gets one guy who's a great marksman. He gets another man who's a bruiser who he describes as being as big as the Woolworth building, which was the biggest building at the time. He gets another one who's good at IT, which is at that time how to bug the telephones, going through the telephone exchange. And he gets other people who are good at surveillance. And he puts this team together, and they go into battle against this incipient German spy network. At the same time, the war in Europe is, to the Germans' surprise, starting out to be a long and very costly war. Trench warfare is existing now in Europe, and it looks like it'll go on for years and years. And they decide they need someone more professional than von Bernstorff to run their spy network in America. So they recruit Franz von Rintelen. Franz von Rintelen had been a banker in America before the war. He spoke English fluently. He was very debonair. And they tell him that they want him to now run this spy network. He had been working in military intelligence in Germany. And von Rintelen tells Major Nikolai, I'll buy whatever I can, and what I can't buy, I'll explode. And they like that. So they send him off to America. He's going off to America, and he's going on the boat as he sees the Statue of Liberty approaching New York Harbor. He has codes in a false tooth in his mouth that he'll use. He has a new identity, the name tags he sewed in himself that say his name is Emile Gachet. And as he writes in his memoirs, he is now the dark invader, declaring war on the 49 states, and he was going to launch the Manhattan Front. And he does. He sets himself up in the New York Athletic Club, a very Tony address on 44th Street. For example, he goes to the Russians and gets an assignment from them to buy up supplies and munitions for them, and he gets money from them, literally millions of dollars. And then he ships them off on boats, and he makes sure these boats are destroyed at sea, so these supplies are never delivered to the Russians, and he gets to keep the money. How does he destroy the boats at sea? Well, he comes up with a rather ingenious device. It's called a cigar bomb because it's shaped like a cigar, and in the middle it has a little metal wafer. On either side are acid, and the acid, when the boat is at sea, would burn through, and they would put it in sugar bales, which are highly combustible, and then they would go up in flames, and there'd be no trace of what caused this fire, and the ship would sink at sea. He does another scheme involving unions. He figures that the only way these munitions and supplies can get to Europe if the Union stevedores will load them on the boats. So he forms his own union, and he convinces the stevedores to strike, and he's prepared to pay them strike benefits for as long as they want, for year after year, so they won't go out to work. And he also goes on sort of covert operational missions to find new targets. And it's von Rittlen who finds Black Tom, which is right near here in Jersey City, which I think was talked about at the last lecture. It is a munitions depot, which he then targets and sends operatives out there years later, which is destroyed, causing $20 million worth of damage, a blast in Jersey City that was felt all the way, breaking windows on the New York Public Library on 42nd Street, and claimed 5 lives. But as he's spinning this web, there are two, I think, really quintessential von Rittlen terrorist activities that I want to talk about this afternoon. One has its roots in a red brick building outside Berlin, which was previously a German veterinary institution. And what they were doing there, they were experimenting on anthrax and glanders germs. They were trying to see if they could cultivate these germs and then perhaps be able to release them. And as mustard gas was being released in the trenches, the German high command decided it was time to launch a germ warfare attack on the United States. They picked to lead this germ warfare attack a doctor living in Heidelberg at the time, a 27-year-old man, Anton Dilger. Dilger was born in the United States. His father, who was of German extraction, had won a Congressional Medal of Honor in the cavalry in the Civil War. But Dilger went back to study medicine in Germany and was living there when the war broke out. And now he was recruited by the German High Command with his American passport to return back to America and launch this germ warfare attack. And he is carrying a black doctor's bag, and inside this black doctor's bag are cultures for anthrax. And he rents a house 6 miles from the White House, just outside the limits of Washington, D.C., and recruits his brother, who had been running a beer a brewery outside Virginia, and he's now is mixing germs. And they set up a laboratory in the basement of this house. They have von Rittlen's men now, this network that he's established, to go down on ports all along the East Coast and in New Orleans, and their targets are the war horses that the United States is shipping to Europe for the Allies to use. But in the course of this attack on the war horses, they do damage to civilians too. They would sneak up on the war horses and put the anthrax in their nostrils of the horses. And the horses, of course, would get violently ill, but some of it would be spilled on the ground in the corrals. And there were 4 deaths. These are the first deaths in a biological warfare attack in the United States caused by this anthrax. And Tom Tunney, who had no idea what he was up against, just was seeing these horses suddenly dying, had to put together a team that could deal with this and confront it. And it was quite challenging. He was really overwhelmed. Then there was the strange case of Erich Munter. And this case is really indicative of something that we deal now with in terrorism, the lone wolf. That is a man who's not necessarily a member of the organization, but he's sympathetic and he's drawn into it. In 1906, Erich Munter was a professor at Harvard. He was going for his doctorate and teaching German to freshman students. And at the same time, his wife, Leona, was pregnant with their second child, and she was sick. She was violently ill. So he brought in nurses to watch over her, and the nurses would later comment how solicitous Professor Munter was. He would insist that only he could serve his wife this homemade beef broth that he cooked every night, and he would serve it to her, spoon-feed it to her, and she seemed to just gets sicker and sicker. But she managed to give birth, but then 2 days after the birth, she died. And Munter was grief-stricken, and he decided that he had to take the newborn baby and his one surviving 3-year-old child back to his in-laws who lived in Chicago. He needed Leona to be buried by her parents, and he appealed to the medical examiner in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to let him take the body away right away. He wanted to leave the next day. And the medical examiner said that that's not possible, Professor Munter. But Professor Munter pleaded and pleaded, haven't he and his children suffered enough? We need to get some closure. Let us be done with this. So the medical examiner said, well, what kind of problem can it be? A Harvard professor's wife died. That's a tragedy. It certainly is not a crime. So he allows Munter to take the body off on train the next morning, and Munter and his wife, and his wife's body, his 2 children, and the 2 nurses all go to Chicago. At the same time, the medical examiner had second thoughts, and he decided that maybe he should do some tests on the body, and he took some blood samples and removed some of the internal organs, and he passed these on to people at the Harvard Medical School. So while they're examining this, Munter is in Chicago, and he's with his in-laws, and he's at the grave, and he's totally distraught. And after the graveyard ceremony, he tells his father-in-law, look, I have to get away. I need some time on my own. Will you just watch the children for a couple of days, and then I'll return? And the father says, of course, Eric, it's been hard. So Munter goes off, and he never comes back. And 2 days later, the Cambridge police have sent a warrant that the tests have proven that Munter poisoned his wife with arsenic poisoning. The Harvard professor killed his wife. And Munter is now on the lam. And he makes his way to Mexico. He shaves off his Van Dyke beard. He starts dressing differently. He gets a pair of false glasses. And he now is claiming his name is Frank Holt. And he spends 2 years in Mexico doing itinerant jobs. And he finally works his way back to America and enrolls in an agricultural college in Dallas. And he enrolls in the German department. And while he's there, he meets a minister's daughter, a Methodist minister's daughter from Dallas. And her name, too, is Leona. And he marries his second Leona. And he graduates with honors. And he goes on the road as an itinerant teacher. And by 1915, he's worked his way back to Cornell University, to the Ivy League, and he's now, as Frank Holt, a professor. Meanwhile, the war is broken out in Europe, and his sympathies are totally with Germany, and he wants to do something to help. So at the end of the term, he tells Leona, he now has 2 children with her, tells her, go back to Dallas, I'll join you there soon. But instead, he doesn't go to Dallas. He goes to New York. And when he comes to New York, he has really no resources. He gave all the money he had to Leona. And he comes to New York, and he's able to, within a matter of days, check himself into a hotel, rent a cottage out in Long Island, get a car, purchase 174 pounds of dynamite, and go to Philadelphia to pick up 2 revolvers. And how does he do this? Tunney later finds out that he was able to get in touch with von Rittelen's network and be able to work with them. And he now, working with von Rittelen, launches a plan that unfolds on the weekend of the July 4th weekend of 1915. And what he does is he first goes down to Washington, D.C., and he puts a bomb, just walks into the U.S. Capitol building, puts a bomb there, and it goes off at 10 o'clock that night and causes great damage to the Capitol building. As soon as it goes off, Holt, originally Munter, is on a train returning to New York, and he's on his way to his next part of his mission. He's going out to Long Island, and he's now targeted the richest man in the country, J.P. Morgan Jr. Why does he want J.P. Morgan Jr.? Because Morgan is head of a consortium that's underwritten $900 million worth of bonds to help the Allies defeat the Germans. And he wants to get rid of J.P. Morgan. And he has a very ingenious cover that will get him close to J.P. Morgan. The von Rintelen organization has supplied him with a card that says he's a member of the New York Social Directory, and he's coming to J.P. Morgan's house to interview J.P. Morgan about his plans for the summer and the summer parties ahead. But as soon as the taxi cab drops him off in front of J.P. Morgan's estate, and he knocks on the door, he's carrying a suitcase filled with dynamite, and he has 2 revolvers in his waistcoat. The door is opened by the butler. The butler's name is Physic. It's real. I couldn't make that up. And he looks at this guy, and Holt presents the card from the New York Social Directory. And the butler thinks there's something suspicious, and he tries to slam the door on him. But Holt, or Munter, storms his way in, pulls a gun, and the butler runs off. And it's the whole ways along, and the butler somehow disappears. So now Munter is going through the house, going door for door, looking for J.P. Morgan. And what he finds are J.P. Morgan's 2 young children, who are 9 and 6. And he takes them at gunpoint up the stairs to try to find their father, J.P. Morgan. Along the way, Mrs. Morgan sees this man holding a gun on her 2 children. She screams. This scream alerts J.P. Morgan, who sees his 2 children at gunpoint. He sees his wife screaming, and he throws himself at Munter. Munter fires once, then twice, and the 3rd and 4th time the gun jams. But these first 2 bullets lodge in J.P. Morgan's abdomen, and he falls on top of Holt, and Holt, who's skinny, is trapped by the 250 pounds of J.P. Morgan, and now all the servants come out and they batter Holt into unconsciousness. And Morgan is severely wounded. It looks for a while that he'll die, but he survives, while Holt is now taken to the Syosset, New York police headquarters. Tunney is brought in from New York to interrogate him. And it takes 2 days, and Holt finally reveals that his name is Erich Munter, and yes, he placed the bomb in the U.S. Capitol building, but that's all he's going to say for now. So Tunney goes back to New York, but before he goes, he says, "I'll be back tomorrow. Just keep this man under guard. Keep him under guard." And they say, "Well, sure, of course." But they take him to the Riverhead jail, and they keep him under not a very strict guard. But that night, as Holt is sitting in his cell, there's a loud noise. It sounds like a shot rang out. And there is Holt dead. It seems he was shot by an assassin. Or at least that's the first report. Because by the next day, this report that he was shot by an assassin has now been superseded by a report that he jumped out of his cell into the ground below and burst his head open. You'd think there'd be an autopsy, but there was no autopsy. And the New York Times is playing up this story. It's on the front page for 2-3 days in a row, saying that Holt could not have made that bomb that went off in the Capitol building. It was way too sophisticated, that he had been shot. And then suddenly, Tunney sees that the story just disappears. It's not mentioned again in the papers. And he realizes the U.S. government has sent out word to kill this story. The U.S. government is not ready to go to war. But not long after that, after the Black Tom explosion, after the Zimmerman telegram, which reveals that the Germans were trying to get Mexico to declare war against the United States, President Wilson's vast patience is suddenly broken, and we declare war on Germany. Now, with a man as complicated as Woodrow Wilson, it's hard to say precisely what was the straw that broke the camel's back. But 2 months after he declares war, the nation declares war, on June 1917, he gives a Flag Day address. And in that address, it's a very candid, very emotional speech. He talks about how he feels personally betrayed, how the German ambassador was a friend of his, a man he had dinner with, and yet we let these people into our country and they acted as spies and conspirators and terrorists. What right-thinking nation, what proud nation would not want to fight back after these indignities? And that, I think, explains what helped push the United States to war. The German plan that they would break the will of the United States completely backfired. And now Tom Tunney and his men are now taken into the U.S. Army. Tom Tunney is now a major, and his mission is to protect the homeland. And Franz von Rittlen, he winds up in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. So it is now 100 years since that war, and at the time, after the events of 1915, after these first terrorist attack, the New York City police chief, Arthur Woods, said, "The nation can never be caught napping again. We must always be prepared." Well, these are good words, but of course we've been hit again and again. We live in an open society. It's hard to protect America. We have malls, we have Super Bowls, we have marathons. People who are U.S. citizens like Eric Munter, these lone wolves, we can't stop them from being in our midst. We're now in a presidential election year, and candidates can say they have great plans, amazing ideas, and we have to keep some people out. But the reality is that we can't. We live, as I said, in an open society. And what's even more daunting, more troubling, is since those first attacks on America, the means available to our enemies have increased proportionally with the years. You know, Anton Dilger had a basement laboratory with a couple of test tubes with anthrax brewing. Well, now, according to the U.S. Army Germ Warfare Department, mobile biological warfare laboratories can produce 75 different kinds of deadly germ warfare serums. And when the U.S. government had to worry about an attack on the subway in 1915, at that point, 374,000 people were on the subway each day. Now it's 4.5 million people each day. We also have to worry about other weapons that can get into our country. You know, when Holt, or Munter, as he was later known, went into the U.S. Capitol building, he was carrying a suitcase with his little bomb. Now we can put an atomic weapon into a knapsack that could be dropped anywhere in this country. So 100 years later since his first attack, what really is different? What really have we done to improve things? I think the answer is, ultimately, we're still in the same situation. Ultimately, we have to depend on men like Tom Tunney and his ingenuity, his dedication, and his commitment to making sure that the homeland is safe. Thank you.
Take some questions.
I'll be glad.
And you'll repeat the question.
I'm going to take questions and I'll repeat them. If there are any. Ma'am? Well, the question is, this seems like the perfect plot for a Hollywood movie, and there's a pretty good chance. Bradley Cooper bought the rights through Warner Brothers, and he's attached to produce it. There have been 2 scripts written, and they've been pretty mediocre, so now they're going back for a 3rd. So we'll see what happens. I hope, and for my children's tuition's sake, for the bursars of their colleges, it gets done. Sir? The question, as I understand it, is why was America so unprepared, so naive following the Spanish-American War? Well, it's a good question. The question was, why was America so naive following the Afghanistan for 9/11. I mean, right. We couldn't do the next, and we didn't do the next step here. We really didn't have an intelligence network set up. This was really our first intelligence network. We had one man in Washington, Franklin Polk, who was in charge of intelligence for the administration. He was a descendant of the 11th president, James Polk, and he really had no one to work with, and that's why they turned to Tom Tunney. Why did they really go to New York? Polk had gone to the Groton School, and so had the New York City police chief, so they were old boys from Groton, so they felt comfortable with working with one another. Sir? The question is, why isn't it more well known? When I discovered this in the Annals of Intelligence, the CIA magazine, I asked myself the same question. So I quickly went on the internet to see, has it been written about before? And there were a couple of books here and there. Chad Millman, who wrote about Black Tom. No one had really put it together in its entirety. And that's why now I sat down and wrote Dark Invasion, and hopefully now it will become more well-known, and the movie will make it a household word. Sir?
Tell us a little bit more about
Well, the question, that's from Kevin Hallahan, a former FBI agent, member of the Terrorist Task Force, who kindly came to hear me speak. I first met Kevin when I was working at the New York Times, and I covered an operation he was involved in the South Bronx. And so it's really nice that he came here. He's had a distinguished career in law enforcement and anti-terrorism activities. Anton Dilger, who was this doctor, was a very strange guy. He had a thick mop of blonde hair, extremely handsome. He was engaged to 3 different women simultaneously, and he also had a boyfriend in Germany. His father emigrated from Germany before the Civil War, and as I said, won a Congressional Medal of Honor for leading a cavalry attack. And yet his mother came from a family of distinguished doctors from Heidelberg, and she wanted her son to be like his grandfather, who was one of the most famous men in German medicine. So he went to Heidelberg, and he opened up a lab that was doing research in microbiology, one of the precursors of the present microbiological revolution. And while he was doing this, the German government came to him, and they made him an offer that he really couldn't refuse. They said, go back to America and lead this attack. It was a way to go back to America, and it was a way to serve the fatherland, and he thought it would make his parents proud. At that point, I think he saw himself as more German than American. Why he did this is, if one can understand that, one understands why the Boston Marathon bombers turned on this country when they seemed so American, why in Orlando they turned on America, why in San Bernardino. These ideas of, it's not so much keeping people out. The danger is people who are already here, who have American passports, who can get into this country and turn on us. And he is the personification of that sort of villain. The question was, were they particularly eager to kill people? Well, they weren't particularly eager. They didn't want to do blind terrorism. It was more aimed at specific sites. But in the course of their activities, the ship fires, the munition plant fires, over 140 people were killed. So there were ancillary targets. Sir?
how many ships?
Approximately 65 or so ships were destroyed at sea or damaged in different parts. It was what was so amazing, it was like 22 ships had already caught fire, and they didn't know the U.S. authorities didn't know what was doing it. They thought maybe this is a labor dispute, maybe these are accidents. They couldn't quite put the pieces together until the British Secret Service came to them with this information. That's how unprepared we were. Yeah. The question is, were there any terrorists found in Hoboken? Yes. There was a German spy who had worked in he was in the German army. He was in the trenches, and he came up with an idea for doing something called the rudder bomb. He had been an engineer, and he just wanted to get out of the trenches. So you would attach this device to a rudder of a ship, and when they turned the rudder, it would turn the mechanism of the bomb, and it would blow up, and there'd be out any trace. It was a sort of ingenious device. So when he told this to his superiors, they then sent him to Berlin, and they finally sent him here so he could put the rudder bomb on ships, and he was based in a rooming house in Hoboken. They did catch him, yes. I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
Was there a legislative body of
Yes, the question is, was there, I think, a fiat of this war declared against the United States? What made this so interesting, what made the president so enraged, what made Woodrow Wilson so filled with anger, is that there was no declaration of war against the United States. These were completely undeclared terrorist activities, and the United States was not prepared for this, nor did it expect this or suspect it. Well, the German spy network had money. Where it came from, it wasn't declared, but they had a treasury. Von Bernstorff, as I said, was given $150 million worth of treasury notes to set up his organization. So they had ample funds. Funding was not the issue. Thank you very much.